Welcome back, everybody, to today's webinar here at Bina, continuing on with the topic 13 Principles of Faith, principle number 8, part 5. Don't forget, of course, if this is the first time you are watching, to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do that by hitting the subscribe button right at the bottom of your video. You can hit the bell there as well, so you'll be notified as soon as we go live. So, in continuation of what we started to discuss on Monday, we're discussing principle number 8, that the Torah that we have, both the written and oral Torah, are divine, meaning that they're from God. And we discussed on Monday the various parts of the oral law and what it means that they're divine, and the concept of dispute. And we mentioned that the Rambam says that there are really three, or sort of you can put it into two categories of what is part of the oral law. You have the tradition, things that were told explicitly to Moshe Rabbeinu by God and was passed down from generation to generation. And the Rambam says about that there are no disputes. That's not arguable. No one ever said, I have this tradition, and the other sage said, I have this tradition. Talking about the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, there's no disputes about that. Disputes are where it was left up to the sages to interpret the law, using the God-given system, of course, and that's where you have disputes. And of course, the conclusion is also God-given, because the conclusion is following God's law to go after the majority. That is where we ended off on Monday. I just want to get into it a little bit more, and just show you how sacred our tradition is, things that were passed down from generation to generation, how much we hold them to be true. There's a fascinating passage in the Talmud that discusses the tzitz. The tzitz was sort of like the head plate that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would wear in the temple. And the Gemara, the Talmud, is discussing what exactly it looked like. And it says like this, that we have been taught that the tzitz was a gold plate, 2 finger breadths wide, which encircled the forehead of the high priest from ear to ear. Inscribed on it, on 2 separate lines, was God on the upper line and Holy 2 on the lower line. So, La Hashem and Kodesh. So, 2 lines, the inscription on the tzitz were on 2 lines. That's the opinion of the sages. Va'omar Rabbi Eliezer b'Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi, says, Ani re'isiv be'ir Romi. I saw in the city of Rome the Kosov Kodesh La Hashem B'Shita Achas. I saw the tzitz in the city of Rome, and on it was written Kodesh La Hashem, those 2 words, on 1 line. So what are you telling me that it has to be written on 2 lines? It's written on 1 line. That's what the Talmud says. And that ends the discussion. We don't know how the discussion ended. So you would think that he saw the real tzitz, so why would the sages argue with it? Says the Rambam. The Rambam, being Maimonides, the one who we're learning about the 13 Principles of Faith, he's the author of it. And he says in the laws of building the Beis HaMikdash, he says that the way to write the tzitz is 2 lines. Write it in 2 lines, Kodesh La Hashem. If you wrote it on 1 line, it's kosher, he says. But l'chatchila, which means initially what you should really do is write it on 2 separate. You should write it on 2 separate lines. Even though, seemingly, the question is, didn't Rabbi Yossi say that he saw the actual tzitz? So the Meiri, one of the Rishonim, one of the commentators on the Gemara, says like this. I'm reading it inside. For even though Rabbi Eliezer, son of Rabbi Yossi, was one of the greatest of the sages, personally testified, I saw it in the city of Rome, and the words holy to God were written on 1 line. Nevertheless, even this testimony of an actual sighting did not refute or was known to the sages through tradition. That is unbelievable. That means that the sages had a tradition, that the inscription on the tzitz had to be written in 2 lines. Where did they get that tradition from? That tradition was passed down from Moshe Rabbeinu from generation to generation. Even though that another sage who didn't argue on the tradition, because there was never an argument on the tradition, he just said, I never received that tradition, and I saw otherwise in an actual tzitz in Rome. Nevertheless, they didn't budge from their opinion, because tradition is tradition. Now, what does that mean? That means that the sages were so sure of the accuracy of their tradition that they said something he saw was wrong. Either the tzitz wasn't the real tzitz, maybe it wasn't the real, maybe it's just an imitation. Maybe it just looked like the real tzitz. Maybe that wasn't the actual tzitz that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would wear. Maybe it was fake. In other words, you could explain it. Not everything you see means that it is 100% proof. It could be that it was an imitation, it was fake, it was fabricated, whatever the case is. Therefore, the law sticks with the tradition, with the Masorah, with the tradition, what the halacha l'Moshe Sinai, which was passed down from Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai generation to generation. That's how sacred our tradition is. That's how divine the oral law is, that it is considered to be straight from God, and therefore even though someone saw an actual tzitz, and therefore very big probability that is the actual tzitz, and it was written on one line, nevertheless it's on two lines, because that is the tradition passed down from Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai. Moving on to something a little bit different, which is connected actually to the parshiyos which we're reading, the sections of the Torah which we're reading now on Shabbat. And that is part of the fifth book of the Torah, Chumash Devarim. In some places it's called Mishnah Torah, which means like the double Torah, because in Chumash Devarim, in the last of the 5 books, Moshe Rabbeinu basically repeats the entire Torah. Just like we have in the oral law, we have things which are tradition, just passed down from generation to generation, wasn't left up to the sages to interpret on their own, and then we have the interpretations of the sages of their own. We have a similar concept in the written Torah. At the first 4 books, it says, was God speaking within Moshe Rabbeinu. The 5th book, the expression which is used in Devarim, about Devarim, is that Moshe said it on his own. Now, what does that mean? The commentaries all say that the 5th book was also said with divine inspiration. Obviously, the entire written Torah is dictated by God. But nevertheless, there's a difference there. And it's a similar difference, although different, but similar to the tradition in the oral law and the interpretations in the oral law. What does this all mean? So Torah is a very interesting idea in that, on the one hand, Torah really is above our logic. The starting point which we need to start from is that inherently Torah is something that we cannot really understand, because Torah is God's wisdom. God is infinite, His wisdom is infinite, and therefore how are we, finite, mortal human beings, able to understand the infinite wisdom of God? How is that even possible? And the truth is, it really isn't. It's just that God, so to speak, lowered down His wisdom into our world and allowed us to understand it. So in other words, it's almost like it's like a gift that we have, that we're able to understand God's wisdom. But in order for that to work, in order for that to be God's wisdom that we are understanding, there needs to be something in the middle. And that's really what Moshe Rabbeinu is. Moshe Rabbeinu is called Ish Elokim. Now, not that, God forbid, Moshe Rabbeinu is God, obviously not. But he's called Ish Elokim, which means a man of God. What does that mean? It means that on the one hand, he was a man, he was a human being. On the other hand, he was godly. He was fully in the realm of godliness. As the Rambam says, he was almost an angel. He, for all practical purposes, did not live a normal physical life. He was separate from he lived a very holy, a life fully in the realm of godliness and holiness. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu is sort of that middle. He is able to comprehend the godliness of the Torah and then tell it to us as a human being. And that's why us human beings are able to understand it. So he's sort of like the transmitter. He's there in the middle, taking it from being pure godliness, something which we cannot understand, him taking it into himself, which is he's also a human being, and then teaching it to us, and now we can now understand it. Again, I want to emphasize, not that, God forbid, Moshe Rabbeinu is at all God. We don't believe in that in our religion. There's only one God, and we only serve God. But Moshe Rabbeinu was obviously the greatest prophet who ever lived. What does that mean? It means he was so connected to Hashem, he was so connected to God, that he was able to understand Torah. And therefore he was able to take that godly Torah and put it into human intellect. In that itself, he had 2 stages. In the first 4 books of the Torah, it's more emphasized the godliness. Moshe Rabbeinu was almost like a pipe that water goes through. The expression which is used is Shechina medaberes mitoich groimei. The godly presence just spoke within him. He didn't really even think about it. It just sort of it came through his mouth. It was God speaking through his mouth. Devarim, the 5th book, it explains in Kabbalah that Moshe Rabbeinu first, it was dictated to him by God as well, obviously. But he first understood it and then gave it over. So it's almost like you teach something to somebody, they understand it, and they teach it to somebody else. The difference between the two in Kabbalistic writings are derech maiver, is it just passing through, or is it derech hislapshus, which means is it being enclosed in the transmitter first and then he's transmitting it. And that's the difference between the first 4 books and the last book. Because Torah does have these 2 components. It's godly, which means it's transcendent. It's not something that a human being can really understand. And on the other hand, human beings understand it. That is really the 2 opposites which exist in Torah. Now, in generally speaking, this is the difference between the written Torah and the oral Torah. The written Torah, the emphasis is much more on the godliness. In fact, if someone just says the words of the written Torah without understanding it, even that is considered to be learning Torah. Because the understanding is not so emphasized there. It's God's exact word, dictated by God, word for word, through Moshe Rabbeinu, and that's what the written Torah is about. The oral law, Torah Sheba'al Peh, the intellect part is much more emphasized. It's also godly, of course, but the emphasis is much more on our input, on our understanding. That's in a general sense. But the truth is you have these 2 things in both. You have in the written Torah, as I just said, you have the first 4 books and the last book. The first 4 books being much more emphasized the fact that it was dictated by God. The last book, Devarim, Moshe Rabbeinu sort of understanding it first. But really as a whole, the written Torah is really, the emphasis is that the fact that it comes from God. And you have the oral Torah, which also have these 2 things. You have the tradition which is not based on the sage's understanding. It was transmitted orally from Moshe Rabbeinu generation to generation. No dispute, no arguments. Then you have the part of the oral law, which is in the interpretation. This is the sages use their intellect to understand the Torah. It's also godly. Their conclusion is also divine. But the emphasis was much more on the understanding part. So in general, that's the difference between the oral law and the written law, is the emphasis on the godliness, the transcendence, or the understanding. But within both, you actually have both, because really the entire Torah is supposed to have both. On the one hand, we need to know it's godly, it's divine. On the other hand, we need to know that we also need to understand it. That's the whole purpose of Torah, is that we should be able to understand it. We still need to discuss this, and we're going to get into next week. When we are discussing that section, that part of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, that part we need to understand how it's divine, how each opinion is divine. How can you have conflicting opinions and both of them are really godly and both of them are God's wisdom? That still needs to be explained. And then we'll continue that next week. Meantime, have a wonderful Shabbos, a wonderful weekend, and of course, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Have a good day.